My name is Ayla Torres. If you knew me before the fire, you would have called me soft. You would have told me I smiled too easily, that I forgave too readily. You would have said I was the kind of person who believed kindness could fix cracked things. I don't say that to shame that version of me. I say it to mark the distance between who I was and who I had to become. I grew up in a small, green neighborhood where neighbors left pies on stoops, and everyone knew which kid had learned to ride without training wheels. My father had hands like maps, calloused and honest, and my mother made the best arroz con polo anyone in our town had tasted. As a child, I learned two important things: how to notice subtle shifts in people's faces, and how to keep my promises. Both would be useful later. I moved to Los Angeles at 22 because the city seemed to contain, in its lights, every possible version of yourself you could ever be. I studied graphic design, learned to work with pixels the way my father worked with wood, and fell hard into the small, bright world of digital art. My work was intimate: vector portraits with the feel of watercolor, collages that looked like dreams. People began to like what I did. Galleries sent polite emails. A boutique clothing brand asked me to do a capsule collection. For the first time my work paid, and then I met Marco. He had a smile that seemed to know every camera angle. He was a photographer: sleek bags, longer hair than mine, a laugh that made people turn toward him. We met at a launch party for a mutual friend. He told a story about a road trip to Baja and how he once saved a dog from the side of the highway. I believed he had a generous heart because it seemed to have room for other people's ruin and rescue. We kissed on a balcony that night with cheap champagne, and the city spread beneath us like a map you could get lost in intentionally. Our life together happened quickly and sweetly. We collaborated on projects. He took photographs of my prints that later became the hero images on my online shop. He was the kind of man who made opportunities feel like favors. I felt seen, I felt held, I felt dangerously safe. A loving partner is a rare thing in an industry that often asks you to sell your privacy to be seen. Marco insisted on being in the background. I like observing. He'd say, while also slipping around the edges of every conversation as the person with connections. He was generous in ways that made people like him, and I leaned into it gratefully. I made mistakes. Who doesn't? I told him passwords over dinner when my hands were sticky with empanada sauce. I left drafts on the desktop labeled private, unfinished paintings and messages I wrote to myself at 4 a.m. I trusted because he asked in a way that didn't feel like asking. If you had watched my life in slow motion, you would have seen the tiny soft betrayals: a note forgotten on the fridge, a phone left face up with a camera open. The first sign of storm came small and ridiculous. A DM from a curator we'd been courting for months, blunt and cruel. "We can't feature these images," the message said. "They look plagiarized." Then another DM saw a post claiming credit. Weird. I thought it was a misunderstanding. I messaged Marco, heart rattling. He insisted it was a glitch, a jealous person, and deleted an old comment under my profile. He said things that soothed me like bandages. Then a private file appeared on an art message board. A leak of an unreleased series. Sketches and test pieces I never published. Someone had posted a screenshot of an early concept of a mural I'd only shown to one friend. The screenshot had side notes. Private feedback I'd left in a doc with a time stamp showing hours I was asleep. Within 12 hours, the hashtag appeared on every platform. #Ayla the fraud. Someone created an account to share proof that I was copying other emerging artists. They spread altered messages so my notes looked like excuses. The internet knows how to punish. It is a machine that takes rumor, tempers it with performative fury, and feeds it back to you in the lowest light. People are often more certain online than they are in the messy, real world. They need a simple story. The bright new artist is a cheat. That story makes them feel smart. At first I thought I would weather it. I messaged the moderators. I wrote a thread explaining my process. I cried in my bathtub and told myself I would not let this ruin me, but the nights narrowed down to the sound of my notifications. They were poisonous the way a foss. It is poisonous if you watch it long enough. Brands paused negotiations. My shop received returns I didn't expect. A friend who had agreed to collab quietly wrote, "I'm not sure this is the right time." People I liked took small steps back. Even my mother, in a voice smoothed with worry, asked me at dinner, "Are you sure you didn't reuse something? People are saying things." I could hear the caution in her voice, the way love sometimes becomes fear when it can't make sense of a rumor. And then the leak turned intimate. Someone posted private messages between me and a friend, messages that were pasted together, edited to look like I had taken credit for an idea that had been theirs. The worst of it was a set of photographs, ones I had shown only to Marco in the early days. Intimacy, presented to the world like evidence of fraud. The account framed me as a liar who withheld credit for the help of others. The comments multiplied like mold. People stabbed at my life with furious accusations. I woke up to strangers in my direct messages congratulating the other artist, to old clients asking for refunds, to an email from a lawyer threatening copyright action if I didn't clarify authorship. In 48 hours, I remember the wallpaper in my studio with floral pattern became oppressive, like it wanted to talk back. I sent one message to Marco, raw with hurt. He said he could help. He said he would handle it. He kissed me and said soothing things. That kiss tasted like something that would later gather smoke. Soft betrayal is often the most vicious. A person can stand beside you while they're pulling your name out of the hat. Marco stopped answering important emails. He began staying late at shoots. The photos we'd shot together were used in ways I didn't approve of, then posted as collaborative triumphs on his feed with a caption that read, "We're rising together." The "we" put me in quotes. One night I came home to our apartment to discover that my laptop, my only access to clients, my whole digital archive, was gone. He told me he had taken it to clean files because something about the leak must have been me. His explanation was a soft, imprecise apology. The next morning, a photograph of my unreleased mural floated around Instagram with a caption, "Here's the real creator. Why do people bother with fakes?" It had my handwriting on a note attached to it. The handwriting I recognized from the journal where I wrote fear at 4 a.m. You can tell a lot about people by the way they betray you. Marco laughed about controlling the narrative. In an old voice memo I discovered later, he had spoken about the people in our scene needing clarity so they would follow the right leader. He had always wanted to be seen as the wise, generous architect who could build an image for everyone. The ironic thing about image making is that someone has to be willing to destroy the truth to build your myth. When I confronted him, he told me the story that so many men who profit from other people's work tell. He had helped me. He had mentored me. He had made me something. "You'd never have gotten this far without me," he said with the certitude of someone who believes his own myth. At that moment, an odd elemental rage rose in my body. I went cold in a way I had only read about in novels. My hands shook, but my voice was focused steel. "You put my life online," I said. "You took what was mine." He looked, for the first time, like a man realizing the gravity of being seen. He whispered, "I didn't mean it to go that far." Everyone who tells you I didn't mean it eventually discovers that their words are tools to carve away consequence. They did not just take my reputation. They took the first frayed piece of who I'd imagined myself to be, an artist who earned my small pleasures honestly. Suddenly, the small wins, the packaging of a newly printed print, the first paid commission, suddenly looked like souvenirs from a life that might never be mine again. I thought about disappearing. I thought about leaving the city. I thought about burning everything and starting in a place where nobody had access to the images used against me. For months I did leave, literally and figuratively. I closed my shop, took a bus north, and lived in a small town with a single streetlight and a bakery that remembered your name. People thought I had quit. In some ways I had. The difference was that I wasn't defeated, I was gathering. On a rainy Monday in September, I sat on a bench and made a small list. This is not the place for cleverness or the brazen theatrics of revenge. This is the place for a patient, methodical, legal, and cultural dismantling. I would not lash out blindly. My plan would be methodical. It would be slow like tide and relentless like time. I had been consumed by the noise once. I would use the quiet to learn. First, I learned the architecture of the internet's cruelty. I spoke with a friend who worked in digital forensics and learned how screenshots could be reconstructed, how timestamps could be falsified, how accounts could be created within minutes and then deleted. I learned that truth is not noise. It is a slow accumulation of documents, sworn statements, depositions. If you want to undo a lie, you have to become boringly thorough. Second, I recognized that every artist in a city like ours is either a potential ally or a passive witness. I needed both types. I met with friends who were visual artists, with small time curators who still believed in the messy business of work. I listened more than I spoke. I let them tell me what they wanted: transparency in commissions, better documentation, tools that made it hard for someone to impersonate a creator. Third, and most importantly, I set boundaries. I stopped trusting anyone who saw me as manageable. I changed my passwords. I documented every living thing: files, dates, drafts, the metadata embedded in photograph files. If my handwriting had been used on a photo, I sought the original hard copy journal and the witness who had seen me tape that note. If I had shown a draft to one friend, I asked them to confirm in writing when they had seen it. I transformed my life into paperwork until paperwork could be weaponized in my favor. It took months. There is no glamorous montage where the villain falls within 24 hours. There is a lot of tedious work, emails, followed-up phone calls, and legal noises that sound, to the untrained ear, like courtship of forms. I learned to appreciate the small victories: an email that contradicted a public claim, a timestamp that proved a promised leak, occurred while I was elsewhere. And as I built, I practiced what the city calls reinvention. In a borrowed studio, I painted again, not as a commodity, but as a tether to the part of me no algorithm could steal. I opened a burner account with a small, anonymous handle and published work that was raw and honest. At first, no one noticed. That was the plan. You hide in plain noise until the right moment. By the time 6 months had passed, I had a file thicker than my grandmother's Bible. I had copies of emails showing a collaborator who had been paid with money that traceable to a company linked to Marco's new brand management firm. I had a cousin in another state who remembered him boasting about controlling narratives. I had screenshots, but not the suspect kind, the kind that mattered: invoices, receipts, and a signed note I had kept from the first exhibition that proved authorship. You cannot beat the internet with a rumor. You beat it with documents, signatures, and the slow, boring exercise of filing complaints to the right authorities. I filed a cease and desist against the accounts that had been most aggressive in slandering me. I hired a lawyer who didn't blink when I described the whole mess. She gave me homework. We will unspool this methodically. If we scream, the story turns into witchcraft. If we build, the story turns into proof. There was another element I did not initially account for: the human component. There were people who believed the story I'd been given. They had retweeted cruel comments and boarded a train on which they had only glanced at a headline. They were not monsters. They were impatient, lazy readers with the comfort of distance. It would be easy to cede them to their impatience. It was harder to bring them slowly to the facts, so I started to tell an even quieter story, one directed to people who might be willing to listen. I sent a private message to a journalist I had crossed paths with years before. I told them the truth, and I let them look at my files. They were careful at first. Journalism requires shadows and verification. But once they dug, discrepancies became mountains. At the same time, I made my new work visible and different, not hidden in the noise, but placed strategically. A small online exhibition titled Afterburn, in which I explored the way public shaming charred a woman's life. A friend in PR who believed me handed it to a sympathetic blogger who wrote a piece that did not decry me as the comeback of the month, but rather reviewed the art honestly and mentioned the previous smear with the sensitivity of someone who had asked questions instead of echoing them. It was slow, that is the only honest way to tell it. People like rage, the internet likes spectacle, but what the internet also respects, after a while, is evidence. The activist accounts that had previously shared the smear began to soften when I presented the signed receipts for projects, and when a technician confirmed the metadata of the photographs. There were private apologies emailed to me, the sort of digital hushed confessions that feel like ash. The crucial turning point came when a curator in the Midwest contacted me after comparing two projects that had been attributed to different hands. He saw the same brushwork, the same odd negative space I used, the same tendency to place light in a particular corner. He wrote a simple email with directness, "You should see this." He put my files next to the alleged plagiarists and asked me to verify. The similarity was obvious to anyone with eyes. When a conservator checked the materials, we found inconsistency in the public timeline that made sense only one way. Someone had copied my early drafts and tried to pass them as later work, an attempt to create the impression of precedence. It was a messy, amateurish scam, almost childish in its crudity. People who had been angry at me were now, with the new facts, a little ashamed. I never used threats. I never wrote a viral reveal post. I kept my voice measured and let the documents breathe. It felt like waiting for water to dissolve sugar. The internet shifted. Small pockets of supporters who once had been loud in their condemnation quietly changed their post captions from fraud to oops. Clients who had canceled approached me again. An art director from a respected magazine asked, "Would you consider doing a feature on Afterburn?" I said yes, and in the interview I did not shout. I spoke clearly, in the voice I had practiced in the quiet months by the sea. At the end of part 1 of my life, when the attacks were still hot and the comments stung at night, the work felt impossible, but we are often as strong as the sum of our small acts, the files saved, the receipts kept, the people we asked to stand witness. That is the strange lesson I learned. Survival is a ledger. It is ink and calls and midnight emails. When the public narrative began to bend back toward the facts, I felt something like relief, but the real thing I felt was readiness. The fire had burned much, yes, but it had also cleared the path I needed to walk. I learned how to hold attention without being crushed by it. I learned the difference between someone who casts a net to ensnare and someone who casts a net to gather truth. By the time I prepared to go back, my hair was shorter, my shoulders steadier. I had a plan that would not simply exonerate me. It would expose a system that allows one person's voice to override another's work. I didn't want revenge that would humiliate. I wanted accountability that would prevent another person from being used as a tool of someone else's myth. And so I returned, quietly, precisely, and ready to be seen on my own terms. When you step back into the light after hiding, the light is not a bright burst as you imagine. It is a cautious recognition, like someone peeking through a door to see if the noise has stopped. My return was small at first, a short, careful exhibition in a cooperative gallery, a fine, printed catalog that included the metadata and dates, and a small talk where I explained the technique rather than the drama. But the world is hungry for stories that bow and rise. They like the arc of the ruined woman becoming the hero. So when the first major magazine ran a profile not of my controversy, but of the actual work, my use of negative space, my compulsion for certain colors, people started to lean in for reasons other than outrage. It was like someone had finally changed the channel. Even then, I was careful. My goal was not to torpedo Mako's life with rage. It was to create a structure of truth that would stand when the internet's fickle hunger moved on to the next thing. I wanted to build a network of protectors and witnesses, a kind of civic armor for artists. If I could do that and make sure the same predators had fewer places to hide, I would have paid forward every belated apology I received. The next move was public but precise. I organized a panel called Attribution and Ethics in the Digital Age. We invited curators, legal scholars, small gallery owners, and importantly, people who had been harmed by online misattribution. The idea was simple: create a place where people would not only talk but create a practical policy. We wanted contracts with mandatory timestamps, easily accessible registries for original works, and educational resources for emerging artists. We wanted to demystify the way works were authenticated. Before the panel, I had to decide whether to confront Mako in public. Many urged me to perform the spectacle, an open call-out, a public shaming. Some friends laughed about the irony. You should see his face when you read your own handwriting at the mic. But I had worked too hard to let a petty moment be the centerpiece. Accountability is boring. It's subpoenas and depositions and lawyers who read invoices in rooms with low light. So the panel focused not on personal vengeance, but on building a structure that would make the next smear more difficult. On the night of the panel, I walked into a civic center buzzing with curiosity. The room was full of artists who wanted to learn, lawyers who wanted to fix policy, curators who wanted to preserve history correctly. In the front row, unlike other nights, I saw no one who had been a viral sword. I saw people who wanted to stitch the community back together, and a handful of people who had never understood art before but now felt protective of it. After the panel, a journalist I had trusted stood and said, "Ayla, people want to know, how did this happen? Who benefited?" That was the moment when the details became relevant. I spoke, not with the rhetorical fireworks others suggested, but with a calm that made people actually listen. I explained how digital fingerprints could be faked, and how a charismatic person with access to drafts and the ability to construct a narrative could weaponize relationships. I told them how a single man could create a chorus around a lie. Journalists asked for names, specifics. I provided evidence to a trusted reporter, copies of the early drafts, files with timestamps, witnesses who could attest to the original dates. The reporting did not scream. It was even, careful, and then suddenly blunt. When the article published, it wasn't a tabloid slap. It was a deeply sourced piece that made the point that the problem wasn't purely personal. It was systemic. That kind of piece does two things. First, it dissuades casual commentators who love spectacle. Second, it forces institutions, galleries, collectors, organizations, to reconsider how they verify authorship. Several galleries that had been quick to condemn me earlier reached out apologetically and requested procedures to avoid future errors. Some small journalists who had once shared the smear issued quiet corrections. As the architecture of accountability began to shift, Mako's world cracked in ways he hadn't expected. People who had once followed him for his curated life began to notice the pattern. Photographs credited to him that looked suspiciously derivative, collaborator credits that had odd gaps. He started losing clients. Small brands that liked his angle got nervous, hoppered into the logic of the market. The people who had once tolerated moral ambiguity began to demand better provenance. The big moment, the public confrontation many people wanted, happened not in a courtroom or on a YouTube channel, but at a charity event where Mako had been invited to speak on mentorship in art. It was the local art fair's gala, a place full of patrons who liked comfortable lines and celebrity names. He gave his talk, smiling, sliding in those words about community, and lifting people up. I had been invited as an exhibitor across the floor. I did not plan to make a scene. Instead, I used the opportunity the way chess players use seeming simplicity. In my booth, I displayed a piece in 3 frames, the original sketch, the leaked, edited photograph, and the final print. The 3 pieces hung beside each other like a lesson in composition. People stopped to read the small captions that explained the timeline, the dates, and the signatures, and then something happened. A local collector, one who had once been impressed by Marco's talk, paused, read the captions, and then walked to the stage. He asked the host, politely but with a smile that contained the weight of what he'd read, if the talk could include a note about provenance. The host, uncomfortable, tried to steer the conversation back. A small media outlet snapped the exchange. When the footage hit the local feeds, the question had a particular honesty to it. How are we verifying these stories? It was not dramatic. It simply nudged the conversation toward procedure, and procedure has teeth. Legal processes followed. Evidence that had been ugly and disorganized coalesced into a file thick enough to make a judge listen. Marco tried to deny, to invent excuses, to retreat into charm and perhaps a dwindling sense of entitlement. But charm is a brittle shield against a binder of signed receipts and verified timestamps. A legal settlement followed. I will not tell you the details because that part of justice is often quiet and bureaucratic, but the settlement included some restitution and, crucially from my perspective, an agreement that a portion of donations that had previously funded ambiguous projects would be audited and redirected to communities that had been promised support. I asked for an apology in writing and a small clause about transparency that made the industry peers squirm. That small clause felt, to me, like a flint in a heart. There were personal quandaries. People wanted the final scene of exposed lover now publicly humiliated. But I was wiser than that. The revenge I wanted had been to rethread the network that allowed someone to weaponize intimacy into celebrity. I wanted preventatives in place. The legal settlement did not make Marco a monster in the eyes of every viewer. People are complicated, but it did make it harder for him to repeat his trick. As the settlement trickled outward and the press recapped the slow saga, I felt a tiredness that felt like quiet triumph. The politics of attention are cruel, and I had stolen the energy back from a system that once chewed me up. I had not screamed to the top of a mountain. I had done dull administrative work. That is not a moral of the internet. It is a reality. Systems are changed with files, not hashtags. There was a final, unexpected moment that brought me a soft kind of pleasure. One of the artists who had been attacked, who had watched the whole thing go sideways, and who had kept his head low, sent me a private message. It read, "I am finally working again." I showed my son that his mother's poster was back up in the community center. For someone else to have a simple victory mattered more than the highlight reels or the trending hashtags. That is where the repair seated itself, small human places. Months later, at a small community event funded by the new transparency provisions, I met the collector who had asked the question on stage. He clasped my hands and said, "You made us better." I wanted to tell him he had made himself better by asking. But I knew the truth. I had made some space where the next person would not be so easily devoured. You may expect the ending of revenge stories to coalesce in a single act of exposure. A viral video with 10 million views, or an onstage confrontation that goes mercilessly viral. Those things make excellent cinema. My ending was quieter and more permanent. When the dust settled, my public profile had changed shape. I was no longer simply the artist who'd been canceled. I was the artist who had been canceled, investigated, and then in a dry, distant way vindicated. But the more important news was subtle. Organizations adopted new policies, community centers had better procurement rules, and small galleries required signed acknowledgments whenever a work was commissioned. I reopened my shop with new terms and a small community clause. Any commission longer than $3,000 required a public ledger and a posted timeline. It seemed small, bureaucratic, and wildly practical. People who wanted spectacle groaned quietly. People who wanted justice smiled and ordered prints. I took a job teaching a short course on digital provenance for emerging artists. The class met on Tuesday evenings. We talked about how to embed signatures in metadata, how to keep hard copies, and how to use the simplest tool documentation as armor. The students were earnest and angry and beautiful in their small eagerness. They reminded me of the reasons I had stayed. Love is a complicated ledger. One night at a gallery, someone approached me and placed a small envelope in my palm. I opened it later and found a note. You taught me to be cautious, not afraid. Thank you. It was unsigned, the sort of anonymous gratitude that is richer than any public praise. People asked me about forgiveness. In conversation, I say this: forgiveness is a private currency. Some days I feel content, others a bitter residue remains. Sometimes mercy feels too expensive, but the thing I have discovered is that I no longer seek anything from Marco because I have built a life in which he is a footnote. I don't need his contrition to feel whole. Maybe that is a form of forgiveness. I did not marry a public figure. I did not become shackled to the same rhythms that had broken me. I remained solitary in ways the city likes to label as independent, but also surprisingly communal. Friends call me with small triumphs. People I have never met email to tell me their own stories. I listen. I teach. I sometimes make art about small domestic things. My mother's hands a bakery corner. It shocks me that I have room for softness again. Years later, someone made a documentary about the era we lived through viral storms and the way culture built heroes and villains at a frightening pace. They requested interviews, and I agreed. Sitting in a small studio with a cup of tea, the director asked, "When you look back, what do you want people to remember from your story?" I thought about the months when I slept little and worked long, the ledger we kept, the calls to unknown lawyers, the patient assembly of files. I thought about the artist who wrote to me about her son, about the community center with its new posted receipts, about the young woman in my class who finally learned to ask for line item invoices. I realized then what I wanted people to remember. I said, simply, I want them to know that the quiet things matter, documentation matters, community matters, that people who think they can weaponize love must one day answer to something heavier than a corrupted narrative, something like truth and the stubborn will of the people who guard it. There is no dramatic final revenge. There is, however, a kind of slow justice that changes behaviors and makes future manipulation more difficult. When I walk past the places in the city where my life used to tangle up, I do not feel the same soft terror. Instead, I feel careful pride. We built something small but enduring, a network that listens. Maybe the best revenge is the one you do not have to take in person. Maybe it's the ledger of receipts you keep, the friends you call when things get dark, the public structure you help create that forces good behavior. I used to think spectacle would make me feel better. It didn't. Paper, patience, and policy did. So when the occasional comment surfaces, someone who once retweeted the smear posts photographs of a new artist and asks, "How did she get away with this?" I smile because someone now has a form to request proof. Someone now knows to ask. That small shift is less cinematic and more human, and it has changed the city I love. My name is Ayla Torres. I was burned in full view once. I rebuilt with a steadier set of tools. I became, in the quiet hours, someone who might be useful to others who face the same furnace of online fury. That's the peace I carry with me, the knowledge that my pain could be transformed into armor, and that armor could be passed forward. If you've watched one of these stories and felt a small flare of hope, let it be that the loud things are not always the true things. Sometimes the slow and tedious acts, saving a file, getting a signature, teaching a child to ask for a receipt, are the ones that keep us from burning a second time